The billionaire sees his family stay calm. During a robbery, something unexpected happens next. Julian Thorne, a man whose existence was defined by a meticulously calculated net worth of $2.8 billion, refused to acknowledge any power in the universe greater than capital. For Julian, life was not a series of emotional milestones or unpredictable twists of fate. It was an endless, highly controlled sequence of acquisitions, leveraged buyouts, and calculated risks. He had spent his entire adult life building an empire in the technology sector, transforming himself from a hungry entrepreneur into a relentless titan of industry. He believed, with absolute and unwavering certainty, that wealth was the ultimate armor. Money dictated the terms of reality. It bought silence, it bought compliance, and above all, it bought immunity from the desperate, chaotic struggles of ordinary human life. The environment surrounding him perfectly reflected this philosophy. They were dining at the Glass Orchid, an establishment that served as an impenetrable fortress of exclusivity for the city's most powerful figures. The interior was a breathtaking testament to sophisticated classical design. Tall, pristine white walls, decorated with subtle and elegant molding, stretched upward toward a high ceiling. From this ceiling hung massive, intricate crystal chandeliers, their glass pendants catching and fracturing the light into 1,000 prismatic shards. It was early afternoon, and warm, natural daylight flooded the room through towering windows, mixing flawlessly with the soft glow of the chandeliers to create an atmosphere of refined, upscale tranquility. The dining room was a flawless grid of neatly arranged tables, each covered in heavy, immaculate white tablecloths. The soft clinking of fine wine glasses, the quiet scrape of polished silver plates, and the muted, polite conversations of the city's elite created a symphony of high-end isolation. Yet, despite the perfect environment, the atmosphere at Julian's table was suffocatingly tense. Seated across from him were the only two people on earth who still dared to treat him as a subordinate. His mother, Nadine, was a woman forged in the unforgiving, brutal realities of their past, long before Julian had ever seen his first million. She was an elderly African woman of striking, unyielding elegance. Dressed in a dark, impeccably tailored formal dress, she carried herself with a regal, quiet dignity. Her short grey hair framed a face that was weathered by decades of hardship, but hardened into a mask of permanent resilience. Beside her sat Warren Caldwell, her husband of 15 years. Warren was a distinguished, broad-shouldered man in his late 60s, possessing short grey hair and a meticulously trimmed grey beard. He wore a perfectly tailored navy blue suit over a crisp white dress shirt, looking every bit the part of a retired executive. Julian, however, harbored a deep, simmering contempt for Warren. To Julian, Warren was a relic, a soft, aging man who had simply married into the comfortable life that Julian had built for his mother. Warren rarely spoke of his past, spent most of his days reading quietly or tending to his greenhouse, and never displayed the ruthless, aggressive ambition that Julian respected. "You look at the world through a keyhole, Julian," Warren said quietly, his voice a low, steady rumble that barely rose above the ambient noise of the restaurant. He was resting his hands on the white tablecloth, his posture completely relaxed. "You believe that because you can buy the building, you control the weather outside of it. It doesn't work that way." Julian's jaw tightened. He adjusted the cuffs of his own sharp blue suit, his dark eyes narrowing with irritation. "I control everything that matters, Warren. I employ tens of thousands of people. I influence markets, security, peace of mind, power. These are commodities. I bought them. You wouldn't understand the mechanics of leverage because you've spent your life standing in the background." Nadine's dark eyes flashed with a sharp, maternal warning. "Julian, that is enough. You will not disrespect my husband at this table." "I'm simply stating a fact, Mother," Julian replied, his voice dripping with condescension. Warren thinks the world is built on abstract concepts like karma or street justice. It's built on capital. End of story. Warren didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He merely looked at Julian with an expression of profound, almost pitying patience. It was that exact look, the calm, unbothered gaze of a man who refused to be intimidated by billions of dollars, that infuriated Julian to his core. He could break entire corporations, yet he could not make this old man blink. Unable to tolerate the quiet defiance any longer, Julian abruptly pushed his chair back. The wooden legs scraped harshly against the marble floor, a loud, ugly sound that momentarily disrupted the refined symphony of the restaurant. He grabbed his crystal glass, halfway filled with an expensive vintage red wine, and stood up. "I have a conference call in 10 minutes, Julian lied coldly, not bothering to look at Warren. "I'm going to sit at the corner table where it's quiet. Enjoy the appetizers." Without waiting for a response, Julian walked away, leaving his mother and stepfather seated alone in the absolute center foreground of the massive dining hall. He found an empty, isolated table near one of the large columns, sat down heavily, and took a deep, angry sip of his wine. He stared at them from a distance, watching the two older figures conversing quietly, isolated in the center of the elegant room. He felt a surge of arrogant vindication. Let the old man talk about his philosophies. Julian had the money. Julian had the power. He was untouchable. The illusion of Julian's untouchable reality shattered exactly 3 minutes later. It began not with a shout, but with a catastrophic sound of destruction that seemed to tear the very fabric of the elegant room. The heavy, brass-handled glass doors at the entrance of the glass orchid did not just open. They were violently smashed inward. The shattering of thick security glass echoed like a bomb blast, instantly silencing the polite murmurs and the clinking of silverware. Julian froze. The wineglass stopped inches from his mouth. His heart seized in his chest. Two men exploded into the refined, sunlit sanctuary. They were a terrifying intrusion of pure, unadulterated street violence cutting through the classical sophistication of the room. They were dressed completely in dark, tactical black clothing, their faces entirely concealed by thick black ski masks. But it was the heavy, brutal geometry of the black semi-automatic pistols in their hands that instantly drained the blood from Julian's face. "Nobody moves! Get your hands on the tables, now!" the lead robber roared, his voice a frantic, aggressive bark that bounced off the tall white walls and the delicate molding. The atmosphere in the restaurant inverted in a split second. The warm, natural daylight suddenly felt harsh and exposing. The quiet sanctuary devolved into a theater of pure terror. Around the restaurant, the wealthiest citizens of Chicago reacted with primal, unfiltered panic. Some of the wealthy guests sat completely frozen, their eyes wide with disbelief, paralyzed in their seats. Others immediately began to weep, dropping expensive jewelry onto the floor, their faces twisted in shock and overwhelming worry. Elegant chairs with cream upholstery and dark wooden frames were violently knocked over as patrons scrambled to cower beneath the tables, the furniture slightly displaced and abandoned, leaving a stark visual of sudden chaos. Julian could not breathe. He remained seated at his distant table, his hand gripping the stem of his wineglass so tightly his knuckles turned entirely white. He turned his head slowly toward the unfolding scene, his face a portrait of tense, suspicious horror. His mind, usually a supercomputer of logic and strategy, completely short-circuited. There was no leverage here. There was no buyout clause. His $2.8 billion could not stop the hollow points loaded inside those black steel weapons. The masked men moved with aggressive, threatening posture, their arms fully extended as they swept the room with their muzzles. They ignored the cowering patrons on the periphery and marched directly into the center foreground of the restaurant, precisely where Nadine and Warren were sitting. Julian's breath caught in his throat. He wanted to scream, to stand up, to offer the men whatever they wanted, but his body betrayed him. Fear, a cold and foreign poison, pinned him to his chair. The robbers stopped right behind the table of the elderly couple. The lead gunman, breathing heavily, aimed his pistol directly at the back of Warren's head, while the second robber pointed his weapon at the surrounding crowd to keep them pinned down. From his vantage point, Julian watched the scene frame itself like a hyper-realistic, terrifying painting. The tall windows pouring light onto the white tablecloths, the glittering chandeliers above, the two imposing figures in black ski masks standing behind the table, and in the center, his mother and his stepfather. But as the initial wave of blinding panic began to recede, Julian noticed something that made his blood run cold for an entirely different reason. The people around them were crying, hyperventilating, and begging. Yet Nadine and Warren did not flinch. They did not scream. They did not scramble under the table or cower in fear. Slowly, deliberately, the elderly African woman and the distinguished older man in the navy blue suit raised their hands. They did not raise them in frantic, desperate surrender, but with a smooth, almost practiced calmness. Their expressions, illuminated sharply by the cinematic contrast of the daylight mixing with the chandelier glow, were perfectly visible to Julian. Nadine's face was tense, but there was no terror in her dark eyes. It was a look of cold, calculating observation. And Warren, the man Julian had dismissed as a soft, weak relic, sat perfectly straight. His posture was immovable. His hands were raised, but his face, framed by the trimmed grey beard, was deadpan. Serious. Completely and utterly unafraid. The lead robber, noticing the unnatural lack of fear from the old man sitting inches from his gun barrel, stepped closer, his posture growing even more aggressive. "I said face down, old man! Face on the damn table!" The masked man screamed, pressing the cold steel of the pistol against the fabric of Warren's perfectly tailored blue suit. Julian's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He waited for his stepfather to beg, to plead for his life. He waited to witness the breaking of the fragile, quiet man he had spent years mocking. Instead, Warren slowly turned his head to look back at the masked man. His hands remained raised, but the atmosphere around him seemed to grow impossibly heavy. And then, something entirely unexpected happened. The silence that followed the initial violent crash of the glass doors was not truly silent. It was a horrifying vacuum filled with the sharp, ragged intakes of breath, the quiet, pathetic whimpers of the extraordinarily wealthy realizing their absolute vulnerability, and the heavy, aggressive thud of the masked men's combat boots advancing across the imported marble floor. From his secluded, cowardly vantage point in the shadows of a large, fluted architectural column, Julian Thorne experienced a profound and agonizing physiological collapse. The man who routinely decimated rival corporations, dismantled entire global supply chains without a second thought, and viewed human beings purely as leverageable assets, was now entirely immobilized by a primal, suffocating terror. His lungs felt as though they had been filled with rapidly hardening cement. His perfectly manicured fingers remained rigidly wrapped around the crystal stem of his wineglass, the deep crimson liquid inside trembling violently, mirroring the chaotic, terrified thrum of his own racing pulse. Julian's eyes darted frantically across the elegant, sunlit expanse of the glass orchid. The scene unfolding before him was a grotesque, hyper-realistic juxtaposition of high-end opulence and brutal, uncompromising street reality. A few tables away from him, a prominent venture capitalist, a man whom Julian had mercilessly outmaneuvered and publicly humiliated in a hostile boardroom takeover just last month, was now curled into a pathetic, trembling ball beneath a cream-upholstered chair. The man was weeping openly, his tears staining the polished floorboards. A renowned socialite in a bespoke silk dress was desperately tearing a diamond necklace from her throat, her hands shaking so violently she was leaving red scratches across her own collarbone. She was eagerly, frantically offering up the jewels to the masked phantoms before they even had the chance to demand them. This was the true reality of the elite when stripped of their financial armor and their lawyers. They were soft, fragile, and utterly defenseless against the crude, simple mathematics of a loaded firearm. But as Julian's panicked gaze swept back to the absolute center foreground of the restaurant, the breath violently hitched in his throat. The cinematic lighting of the room, the warm, golden natural daylight pouring through the tall, unshattered windows, blending seamlessly with the cool, crystalline glow of the massive chandeliers hanging from the subtle ceiling molding, created a dramatic, almost theatrical spotlight on the table he had arrogantly abandoned mere moments ago. There, standing out vividly against the blurred backdrop of weeping millionaires and terrified, cowering patrons, were his mother, Nadine, and his stepfather, Warren. They had not dived under the heavy, immaculate, white-clothed table. They had not thrown their hands over their heads in a desperate, pleading gesture. They had not uttered a single, solitary sound of distress. Instead, as the two masked assailants loomed directly behind them, radiating violent, unpredictable energy, the elderly couple had simply, and quite deliberately, raised their hands in surrender. It was the specific nature of this surrender that sent a chilling electric wave of cognitive dissonance crashing through Julian's hyper-analytical mind. Their hands were elevated to shoulder height, palms facing forward, fingers relaxed. It was a textbook gesture of compliance, yet it was executed with an eerie, terrifying stillness. There was no tremor in Nadine's wrists. There was no frantic, adrenaline-fueled twitch in Warren's broad shoulders. They were an island of absolute stone-cold tranquility in a raging, pathetic ocean of panic. Julian stared at his mother. Nadine's short grey hair caught the subtle, warm highlights from the chandelier, framing a face that was a masterclass in formidable restraint. Growing up in the unforgiving, impoverished, and deeply dangerous neighborhoods of Southside Chicago, Nadine had seen the devastating, permanent consequences of panic. She had navigated streets where showing fear was equivalent to signing your own death warrant. Julian had always known his mother was a tough, resilient woman, but insulated by his billions of dollars over the last decade, he had forgotten the sheer, terrifying depth of her survival instincts. Her dark eyes were fixed straight ahead, her expression calm but fiercely tense, observing the reflections in a polished silver serving tray on the table to track the movements of the men behind her, without ever turning her head. Then Julian looked at Warren. The man he had openly mocked and insulted less than 10 minutes ago, the man Julian had dismissed as a soft, passive civilian, a mere placeholder in their lives who watered plants and read history books. Warren Caldwell sat with the impeccable, immovable posture of a classical marble statue. His perfectly tailored navy blue suit and crisp white dress shirt remained flawlessly unwrinkled, contrasting sharply with the chaotic displacement of the chairs around them. His short, meticulously groomed grey hair and trimmed beard gave him the appearance of an aristocratic elder statesman, but his eyes told a violently different story. His face was entirely deadpan, completely devoid of any discernible emotion. He did not look like a victim. He looked like a man who was quietly, analytically calculating the precise physical dimensions of the room and the exact capabilities of the men behind him. He looked utterly bored by the violence. The juxtaposition was staggering and deeply unsettling. The armed robbers, dressed entirely in black tactical clothing and thick black ski masks, were practically vibrating with nervous adrenaline. Their postures were aggressive and threatening, their arms rigidly extended, aiming their heavy black pistols with the jerky, erratic movements of men high on their own perceived power. They were the physical embodiment of a lethal threat. Yet, standing in front of them, this elderly couple seemed completely and entirely immune to their terrifying aura. In the shadows of his isolated table, Julian's billionaire worldview began to fracture and splinter. His $2.8 billion fortune, his offshore accounts, his fleet of private jets, his army of corporate lawyers, none of it could purchase the profound, unshakable armor that his mother and stepfather were currently wearing. They possessed a currency Julian did not understand and could never acquire. A terrifying, silent strength that could not be traded on the open market, built not on bank balances, but on a history of surviving the very monsters that were currently holding the room hostage. The lead robber, the taller and broader of the two men, noticed the anomaly too. Predators, even amateur ones, are instinctively attuned to the scent of fear. They thrive on it. It validates their dominance, fuels their aggression, and makes them feel godlike. The weeping venture capitalists and the trembling socialites, cowering under the cream-upholstered chairs, were behaving exactly as the robbers expected. But the unnatural, statuesque stillness of the elderly African woman and the distinguished white-haired man in the center foreground of the room was a glaring, insulting glitch in the script they had rehearsed. It was a direct, unspoken challenge to their absolute authority over life and death in that room. I said, face down, "You arrogant old ghosts! Get your faces on the damn table!" The lead robber screamed again, his voice cracking slightly with a mixture of rage and sudden, inexplicable insecurity. He stepped closer, closing the distance aggressively until the heavy, cold, black muzzle of his pistol was mere inches from the back of Warren's meticulously groomed head. "You think you're special? You think your money protects you from this? Kiss the marble now!" Warren Caldwell did not move a single muscle. His hands remained raised, as steady as carved stone. He breathed in, a slow, highly controlled intake of air that barely expanded his chest beneath the tailored blue suit. He did not blink. Infuriated by the total lack of compliance and the humiliating failure of his own intimidation, the robber's aggressive posture became even more erratic. He violently whipped the gun away from the back of Warren's head and shoved the cold steel barrel directly into the side of Nadine's head, pressing the muzzle hard against her temple with a sickening thud. "Maybe you need some motivation, old man. Take off the rings, lady. Empty the purse, or I swear to God I will paint this beautiful white tablecloth with your brains." At his isolated table 20 feet away, Julian bit down on his own tongue so hard that the sharp, metallic taste of warm blood instantly flooded his mouth. A silent, agonizing scream tore through his throat, trapped securely behind his clenched teeth. His mother. They had a loaded gun pressed to his mother's head. The desperate instinct to act, to throw his wine glass, to scream out that he would wire them $100 million right this second if they just walked away, surged through his nervous system like an electrical shock. But his legs were entirely paralyzed. The suffocating, crushing weight of his own absolute helplessness pinned him to the elegant dining chair. He was the most powerful, influential man in Chicago, and in the only moment that truly mattered, he was completely, utterly useless. He waited in agonizing suspense for his mother to break. He waited for her to cry out, to fumble with her jewelry in a desperate, undignified bid for survival. Nadine Thorne did not move. She merely closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, an expression not of terror, but of profound, exhausted annoyance, as if a fly were buzzing too close to her ear. It was in that terrifying, stretched thin second of absolute, suffocating tension that the carefully crafted illusion of Warren Caldwell completely shattered. Warren slowly lowered his hands. He did not do it abruptly to startle the armed men, nor did he do it submissively. He lowered them with the deliberate, heavy, inevitable grace of a judge bringing down a wooden gavel to finalize a death sentence. He rested his forearms gently on the immaculate white tablecloth, interlacing his fingers in front of him with steady precision. The air in the immediate vicinity of the table seemed to drop 10 degrees. The entire language of Warren's body underwent a horrifying, immediate metamorphosis. The soft, accommodating posture of an elderly retiree vanished into thin air, replaced instantly by the coiled, terrifying stillness of an apex predator waking up from a long sleep. His shoulders broadened. His jaw set into a line of brutal, unforgiving granite, When he finally turned his head slowly to look over his shoulder at the masked man holding the gun to his wife's head, the sheer, concentrated menace in Warren's eyes made Julian physically recoil in his chair from across the room. "Take the barrel off my wife," Warren said. He did not shout. His voice was not elevated or panicked. It was a low, resonant, gravelly baritone that cut through the ambient sounds of weeping and chaos like a surgical steel scalpel. It was a voice completely devoid of panic, devoid of pleading, and completely devoid of doubt. It was the voice of a man who was intimately accustomed to giving orders to violent monsters. The lead robber blinked rapidly behind the eye holes of his black ski mask. He was momentarily thrown completely off balance by the sheer, undeniable gravitational pull of the old man's dark authority. "Shut your damn mouth! I give the orders here, you old—" "You are holding a modified CZ-75. Warren interrupted smoothly, his voice dropping an octave, becoming a lethal, whispering rasp that carried perfectly across the few feet separating them. "But you've filed down the sear mechanism to make it fully automatic, haven't you? It's a remarkably sloppy job. I can see the retaining pin walking out of the frame from here. If you pull that trigger, there is a 40% chance the weapon detonates in your hand, taking 3 of your fingers and a large chunk of your orbital bone with it." The masked man froze completely. The gun wavered against Nadine's temple, the robber's confidence suddenly bleeding out onto the floor. The second robber, who had been aggressively sweeping the perimeter of the room with his pistol, instinctively turned his attention toward the center table, his own weapon lowering slightly in pure, unadulterated confusion. This was not how a robbery of the wealthy was supposed to go. "Furthermore," Warren continued calmly, his cold eyes locking dead onto the dark, terrified pupils visible through the eye holes of the robber's mask, "your stance is entirely off balance. Your body weight is resting heavily on your heels. You're breathing rapidly through your mouth, which means your heart rate is currently sitting above 140 beats per minute. Your hands are sweating. You are not a professional operator. You are a scared amateur opportunist who made the catastrophic terminal mistake of walking through those doors today." Julian watched the scene in absolute paralyzed shock. His stepfather, the quiet, unassuming man who spent his Sunday mornings pruning orchids in the greenhouse and reading dense historical biographies, was meticulously dissecting an armed, volatile, and highly dangerous criminal with the cold, clinical precision of a coroner performing an autopsy. Warren wasn't just stalling for time, he was systematically stripping away the robber's psychological armor, brilliantly weaponizing the man's own physiological insecurities against him. "Remove the gun from her temple," Warren repeated, and this time the words carried a weight so dark, so saturated with genuine implied violence, that the crystal chandeliers above them seemed to dim in response. "Because if you leave so much as a red mark on her skin, the Chicago Police Department will be the absolute least of your concerns. The people I used to work for will find you. They will find your families. They will find everyone you have ever shared a meal with. And they will make a public, agonizing example of you that will echo through the underground of this city for the next 50 years. The heavy black gun, now trembling violently in the robber's grip, slowly pulled away from Nadine's head. The system failure of the robbery was absolute and complete. The hunter, standing in his tactical gear and ski mask, had just realized with chilling certainty that he had locked himself in a cage with the beast. The physical space between the cold, brutally heavy steel of the modified CZ-75 and Nadine Thorne's temple expanded by exactly 2 inches. But in the suffocating, hyper-compressed reality of the elegant dining room, that microscopic distance felt like the parting of an ocean. The lead robber, a man who had stormed through the shattered glass doors of the Glass Orchid, operating on the explosive, intoxicating fuel of violent dominance, suddenly found his own physical mechanics completely failing him. The aggressive, forward-leaning posture that had terrorized the room only moments ago collapsed inward. His broad shoulders visibly slumped under the crushing, invisible weight of the old man's terrifyingly calm baritone. The heavy black pistol in his right hand, which had previously been an extension of his terrifying authority, now shook with violent, uncontrolled tremors, catching the brilliant prismatic light from the massive crystal chandeliers above and reflecting the man's sudden, devastating internal panic. From his isolated, shadowy vantage point behind the fluted architectural column, Julian Thorne experienced a sensation he had not felt since he was a helpless, impoverished child navigating the brutal winters of his youth. Total, absolute psychological paralysis. The billionaire, whose entire identity was constructed upon the foundation of untouchable, godlike control, was reduced to a mere spectator in a theater of raw, unfiltered primal dominance. He watched the scene unfold with wide, unblinking eyes, his fingernails digging so deeply into the palms of his hands that they threatened to draw blood. He was witnessing a hostile takeover, but not one executed with leveraged buyouts, corporate lawyers, or billion-dollar wire transfers. He was watching a hostile takeover of the human spirit, executed with nothing more than posture, eye contact, and the cold, surgical application of absolute certainty. Warren Caldwell did not move to disarm the man. He did not lunge across the immaculate white tablecloth. He simply sat there, his perfectly tailored navy blue suit catching the warm, natural daylight filtering through the tall windows, radiating an aura of lethal, quiet sovereignty. "You are hesitating," Warren stated, his voice dropping into a raspy, gravelly whisper that somehow managed to be more terrifying than a deafening scream. The ambient sounds of the restaurant, the quiet, pathetic weeping of the wealthy patrons cowering under their tables, the ragged, panicked breathing of the second-armed robber sweeping the perimeter seemed to fade entirely into the background, leaving only the devastating clarity of Warren's words. "Hesitation in your profession is a terminal disease. You walked in here expecting a flock of frightened, wealthy sheep. You expected to scream, to wave that poorly modified piece of metal, and to walk out with bags full of expensive watches and diamond necklaces. You did not expect to look a wolf in the eyes." The lead robber swallowed hard, a thick, audible gulp that echoed loudly in the tense silence of the immediate vicinity. The black ski mask concealed his facial features, but it could not hide the rapid, frantic pulsing of the vein on the side of his neck, nor could it conceal the dark, spreading stain of cold sweat seeping through the collar of his tactical black shirt. Who the hell are you?" the masked man stammered, his voice entirely stripped of its previous aggressive bark. It was now the high-pitched, trembling voice of a deeply frightened child who had accidentally wandered into the deepest, darkest part of the woods. Warren slowly leaned forward, just a fraction of an inch, his forearms resting heavily on the table. He did not blink. His steely grey eyes locked onto the terrified dark pupils visible through the eye holes of the robber's mask, pinning the man in place like an insect under a microscope. "I see the crude, faded ink creeping up past the collar of your shirt," Warren said, his tone conversational, yet laced with a chilling metallic edge. "A black serpent wrapped around a crown. You are affiliated with the Southside Kings, which means you answer directly to a man named Marcus Vance. You are a low-level earner, likely trying to pay off a gambling debt or a chemical dependency by hitting a high-end target without Vance's explicit authorization." The second robber, standing a few feet away, audibly gasped. The muzzle of his own weapon dipped toward the marble floor, his entire body freezing in a state of sudden, absolute terror. To hear the name of their absolute, undisputed underworld boss spoken so casually, so dismissively by an elderly man in a bespoke suit in the middle of a high-end restaurant was a catastrophic shock to their systems. "Vance is a cautious, highly disciplined man," Warren continued, his voice relentless, meticulously dismantling the last remaining fragments of the robber's courage. "He strictly forbids unsanctioned daylight hits in Tier 1 civilian zones. He knows that drawing the combined, focused wrath of the federal authorities and the city's billionaires brings heat that melts his entire operation. which means he does not know you are here. And when he finds out that you endangered the lives of the people in this room, he will not protect you. He will serve you to the wolves to protect his own empire." Julian's breath caught in his throat. His entire worldview, an architecture built entirely on the supreme power of capital, was rapidly crumbling into dust. The security he thought he had purchased for his mother, the impenetrable fortress of wealth he had built around their lives, was an absolute illusion. The true shield, the impenetrable, terrifying armor that was currently keeping his mother alive, was the dark, buried history of the man sitting next to her. The man Julian had openly mocked as a passive, useless relic was, in fact, the only real power in the room. "Tell Marcus," Warren whispered, the words carrying a lethal, finalized weight, that the architect is trying to enjoy a quiet lunch with his wife. "Tell him that if I have to stand up from this cream-upholstered chair, I will not simply kill the two amateurs holding the guns. I will systematically dismantle his entire organization from the top down, just like I did to the Romanov syndicate in '98. Do you understand me?" The lead robber took a physical step backward, his combat boot dragging clumsily across the imported marble floor. The gun in his hand was no longer a weapon. It was a rapidly ticking bomb that he desperately wanted to drop. He had just realized with cold, paralyzing clarity that he had not held a gun to the head of a helpless old woman. He had held a gun to the wife of a ghost, a legend, a monster that the monsters themselves checked under their beds for. The absolute silence that descended over the center of the restaurant was no longer the silence of victims waiting passively to be slaughtered. It was the heavy, suffocating, breathless silence of a courtroom in the agonizing seconds right before a truly devastating, irreversible verdict is delivered. The entire dynamic of power within the elegant, sunlit confines of the glass orchid had been violently and completely inverted. The two masked men who had entered the establishment as terrifying harbingers of chaos and death were now effectively hostages to the overwhelming, crushing psychological dominance of the elderly man sitting calmly at the table. But it was in this exact, terrifyingly fragile moment of suspended animation that Nadine Thorne, who had remained as motionless and silent as a statue carved from obsidian, finally decided to intervene. She did not turn her head to look at the trembling man standing beside her. She kept her dark, incredibly sharp eyes focused dead ahead, her posture radiating an aristocratic, terrifying elegance. Slowly, with deliberate, meticulous grace, she lowered her own hands from their surrendered position. She smoothed out a microscopic, invisible wrinkle on the immaculate white tablecloth in front of her, her movements completely unbothered, as if she were simply waiting for a waiter to refill her crystal water glass. "You have exactly 10 seconds to turn around and walk out of those shattered glass doors," Nadine said. Her voice was not loud, but it possessed a cold, piercing, razor-sharp clarity that sliced through the heavy tension in the room. It was a voice forged in the brutal, unforgiving fires of Chicago's most dangerous neighborhoods, a voice that had stared down starvation, violence, and despair, and refused to be broken by any of them. It carried the exact same lethal authority as Warren's, but with a deeply maternal, chillingly pragmatic edge. "If you run now," Nadine continued, her tone eerily conversational, "you might make it to the city limits before my husband makes the phone call that ends your lives. But if you stand here sweating on my table for one more second, you will not leave this building breathing. 5 seconds have already passed." From his shadowy corner, Julian watched the absolute, utter breakdown of the armed assailants. The hyper-realistic, dramatic storytelling moment playing out in front of him was burning itself permanently into his retinas. The daylight mixing with the chandelier light illuminated the stark, humiliating defeat of the robbers. The lead gunman's chest was heaving with rapid, shallow, panicked breaths. He looked at his partner, the second masked man, whose own weapon was now pointing directly at the floor, his entire body shaking violently. There was no unspoken communication needed between the two criminals. The primal, overriding instinct for immediate survival had completely short-circuited whatever pathetic, desperate plan had brought them into the restaurant. They were not looking at a billionaire's family anymore. They were staring directly into the abyss, and the abyss was looking back at them with terrifying, unblinking calmness. "I'm sorry," the lead robber whispered. The apology was a pathetic, broken sound, slipping out from beneath the black ski mask like a dying breath. It was the ultimate humiliating surrender. The man who had threatened to paint the beautiful white tablecloth with blood was now pleading for permission to retreat. Warren Caldwell did not acknowledge the apology. He did not nod. He did not shift his steely, impenetrable gaze. He merely sat in perfect, terrifying silence, the embodiment of a dormant volcano that had chosen, for the moment, not to erupt. The robbers broke. The second man turned first, his tactical boots scrambling wildly, clumsily against the polished marble floor, slipping in his desperate, frantic haste to escape the invisible gravitational pull of the elderly couple. The lead robber stumbled backward, nearly tripping over one of the displaced cream-upholstered chairs, his weapon lowered, his aggressive, threatening posture entirely evaporated into pure, unadulterated cowardice. They did not look back. They did not stop to grab a single piece of jewelry from the weeping, terrified patrons cowering on the floor. They sprinted toward the violently shattered glass doors at the entrance, their heavy footsteps echoing frantically through the high-ceilinged room, until they disappeared entirely into the busy, oblivious streets of downtown Chicago. The threat was gone. The overwhelming, suffocating presence of violent death had vanished as quickly and as shockingly as it had arrived. Yet Julian Thorne remained frozen in his chair, completely unable to process the magnitude of the paradigm shift that had just annihilated his entire understanding of the world. The $2.8 billion sitting in his diversified portfolio accounts suddenly felt entirely weightless, as useless as monopoly money in the face of the raw, terrifying reality he had just witnessed. He had spent his entire adult life arrogant, condescending, and deeply convinced of his own supreme superiority. He had mocked Warren for being soft. He had insulted his mother for settling for a passive life. He stared at the center table. Warren calmly picked up his pristine white linen napkin, unfolded it with steady hands, and placed it gently on his lap. Nadine reached across the table, her hand perfectly steady, and rested her fingers lightly over her husband's hand. They did not speak. They did not celebrate. They simply returned to the quiet, dignified composure of an elegant, sophisticated lunch, entirely unbothered by the fact that they had just mentally dismantled two armed, violent criminals. A profound, crushing wave of shame washed over Julian. It was a physical sensation, heavy and suffocating, settling deep into the marrow of his bones. He realized with absolute terrifying clarity that he was not the protector of his family. He was not the powerful, untouchable titan he believed himself to be. The security he thought he provided was a fragile, transparent illusion, a thin sheet of glass that could be shattered by a single stray bullet. The true, unbreakable foundation of their family, the terrifying, silent strength that truly kept the monsters at bay, belonged entirely to the man with the short grey beard sitting in the center of the room. The man Julian had walked away from. The man he now understood, for the first time in his life, demanded a level of respect that billions of dollars could absolutely never buy. The immediate aftermath of the violent, aborted robbery did not manifest as a sudden explosion of relief. Instead, it settled over the elegant, sunlit expanse of the glass orchid like a heavy, suffocating blanket of profound, collective shock. The frantic, scrambling echoes of the two armed assailants' tactical boots fading into the busy exterior streets of downtown Chicago were replaced by a horrifying, hollow vacuum. For a long, stretched-thin minute, no one in the high-end dining room dared to move. The exceptionally wealthy patrons, The titans of industry, the socialites and the venture capitalists, remained frozen in their undignified, pathetic postures of absolute surrender beneath the violently displaced cream-upholstered chairs. They were trapped in the terrifying, lingering phantom presence of the black steel muzzles that had just threatened to permanently erase their privileged existences. Slowly, the paralyzing spell began to break, replaced by the chaotic, deeply human sounds of surviving trauma. The quiet, pathetic whimpering that had soundtracked the robbery rapidly escalated into open, hysterical sobbing. A prominent real estate developer, 2 tables away from Julian, began to hyperventilate violently, clutching his chest as he crawled out from under a heavy white tablecloth, his bespoke silk tie dragged unceremoniously through a puddle of spilled, expensive red wine. The renowned socialite, who had been desperately attempting to tear her own diamond necklace off moments before, simply collapsed onto the imported marble floor, her face buried in her hands, weeping with the absolute, unfiltered terror of a woman who had just stared directly into the void and realized her immense wealth could not negotiate a ceasefire with death. From his isolated, shadowy corner behind the large, fluted architectural column, Julian Thorne remained entirely motionless, his perfectly manicured hands still gripping the edges of his own table with a white-knuckled intensity. The cinematic contrast of the room, the warm, golden daylight continuing to pour indifferently through the tall, unshattered windows, mixing flawlessly with the cool, crystalline glow of the massive chandeliers hanging from the subtle ceiling molding, felt like a cruel, surreal joke. The physical environment was a hyper-realistic painting of sophisticated luxury, but the psychological reality of the room had been reduced to a primitive, terrifying wasteland. Julian's breath came in shallow, ragged gasps. He stared at his reflection in the pristine crystal of his half-empty wineglass. He was Julian Thorne. He controlled a net worth of $2.8 billion. He commanded a vast, global technological empire. He could bankrupt entire sovereign nations with a coordinated series of short sells and aggressive market manipulations. Yet when the heavy, brass-handled glass doors of the restaurant had violently shattered inward, when the pure, unadulterated chaos of the street had invaded his sanitized, heavily guarded reality, every single dollar of his immense fortune had instantly evaporated into absolute meaninglessness. He had not stood up to protect his mother. He had not stepped between the cold steel of the modified semi-automatic pistol and the people he was supposed to care for. He had sat in the shadows, entirely paralyzed by his own cowardice, silently praying that the violent storm would pass him by. He slowly lifted his gaze, his dark eyes traversing the chaotic, weeping dining room, until they locked onto the absolute center foreground of the restaurant. There, completely undisturbed by the hysterical weeping and the shattered architectural glass surrounding them, sat Nadine and Warren. They had not moved from their impeccably arranged table. The elderly African woman with the short grey hair and the distinguished older man with the trimmed grey beard were calmly, quietly finishing their glasses of sparkling water. The terrifying, lethal aura that Warren had projected only moments ago, the coiled, apex predator stillness that had systematically dismantled the armed robbers without firing a single shot, had completely vanished. It had evaporated so cleanly, so entirely, that Julian almost wondered if his terror-addled mind had hallucinated the entire exchange. Warren Caldwell once again looked exactly like the mild-mannered, quiet retiree who spent his Sunday mornings reading dense historical biographies and pruning delicate orchids in his greenhouse. But Julian knew the truth now. The soft, accommodating exterior was not a weakness. It was a highly calculated, meticulously maintained camouflage. It was the sheath holding a devastatingly sharp blade. The distant wailing shriek of police sirens finally began to bleed through the shattered entrance of the restaurant, rapidly growing louder and more frantic. Within moments, the flashing red and blue strobes of multiple Chicago Police Department cruisers were painting chaotic, dancing patterns across the tall white walls of the glass orchid, clashing violently with the warm, natural daylight. Heavily armed tactical officers in dark blue uniforms swarmed into the elegant dining room, their assault rifles raised, sweeping the area with intense, aggressive precision. The arrival of the authorities only intensified the chaotic weeping of the elite patrons. The wealthy victims frantically grabbed at the police officers, demanding immediate medical attention, demanding their lawyers, demanding to speak directly to the chief of police, their arrogant entitlement rapidly returning now that the immediate lethal threat had vanished. Julian watched as two heavily armored tactical officers approached the table in the center foreground, their weapons lowered but their postures tense. They expected to find two traumatized elderly victims in need of severe psychological and medical assistance. Instead, Warren calmly raised his hand, offering a polite, almost grandfatherly smile to the heavily armed men. Julian couldn't hear the exact words being exchanged over the chaotic din of the room, but he watched the body language of the police officers shift dramatically. They did not treat Warren like a victim. After a few brief seconds of quiet, authoritative dialogue from the old man, the officers gave him a sharp, respectful nod and immediately moved on to secure the rest of the perimeter, completely leaving the elderly couple in peace. They recognized it too. Even the police instinctively recognized the absolute, unyielding gravity of the man sitting at the table. Julian's throat felt as though it were filled with dry, broken glass. The staggering, humiliating realization of his own profound arrogance crashed down upon him, threatening to crush his chest completely. He had spent years, an entire decade of his life, treating this man with open, unapologetic contempt. He had mocked Warren's quiet life, insulted his lack of financial ambition, and actively tried to isolate his mother from the very man who had just served as her impenetrable, terrifying shield. The $8 billion in Julian's accounts was a superficial, artificial construct. Warren Caldwell possessed the only currency that actually mattered when the polite rules of society completely collapsed: absolute, unwavering, lethal competence. It took Julian Thorne exactly 5 agonizing minutes to force his incredibly heavy, trembling legs to support his own body weight. He stood up slowly from his isolated table in the shadows, his sharp blue suit feeling entirely too tight, a suffocating costume of corporate armor that had utterly failed to protect him in the real world. He left his crystal wine glass behind, stepping out from behind the fluted architectural column, and beginning the long, profoundly humbling walk across the imported marble floor. He navigated through the chaotic aftermath of the robbery, stepping carefully around the violently displaced, cream-upholstered chairs and the shattered fragments of wine glasses that littered the elegant floor space. He walked past the weeping venture capitalist, past the paramedics who were now rushing into the building with oxygen tanks and stretchers for the hyperventilating socialites. He ignored the flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers reflecting off the tall classical windows. His entire focus was locked onto the two figures sitting quietly in the center foreground. As Julian approached the table, Nadine slowly turned her head. Her dark eyes, which had remained so fiercely calm and observant while a loaded pistol was pressed against her temple, now looked at her billionaire son. There was no anger in her gaze. There was no resentment or judgment for the fact that he had abandoned them just minutes before the violence erupted. There was only a deep, profound, and slightly sorrowful maternal understanding. She knew exactly what her son was experiencing in this exact moment. She was watching the agonizing, necessary destruction of his ego. Julian stopped at the edge of the immaculate white tablecloth. He looked down at his mother, and then, with immense difficulty, he shifted his gaze to the distinguished older man sitting beside her. Warren Caldwell was gently stirring a fresh cup of coffee that a terrified, trembling waiter had just managed to bring out from the kitchen. The old man looked up at Julian, his expression entirely neutral, his trimmed grey beard catching the warm highlights of the chandelier above them. The terrifying monster that had commanded the room only moments ago was completely gone, locked securely away, back inside whatever dark, deeply buried vault Warren kept it in. Julian started, his voice cracking violently, stripped entirely of its usual arrogant, booming boardroom resonance. He swallowed hard, forcing the words past the massive, suffocating lump in his throat. I should not have walked away from this table. It was the first time in over 15 years that Julian Thorne had offered a genuine, unfiltered apology to another human being. It felt like tearing a piece of his own soul out and leaving it exposed on the table. Warren stopped stirring his coffee. He placed the small silver spoon gently onto the saucer with a quiet clink that seemed to cut perfectly through the ambient noise of the police radios and the sobbing patrons. He looked directly into Julian's dark eyes. "You walked away because you were angry, Julian," Warren said quietly, his low, steady rumble of a voice carrying no malice, only an immovable, factual weight. "You were angry because I refused to validate the illusion that your money makes you a god. And when the glass shattered, you stayed away because you realized for the first time in your adult life that you were completely powerless to control the environment." Julian flinched as if he had been physically struck, but he did not look away. He could not run from the brutal, unvarnished truth of the old man's words. You dismantled them. Without raising a hand, without spending a dime, you broke them. Warren leaned back slowly in his cream-upholstered chair, resting his hands casually on his lap. "Money is a tool, Julian. It is a very effective tool for building structures, for creating comfort, and for buying conveniences. You have built a remarkable empire with it, and your mother is incredibly proud of your intellect. But a tool cannot breathe. A tool cannot stand between you and the chaotic, violent nature of the human animal. You believe that power is forcing the world to bend to your specific demands. Real power, true power, is knowing absolutely, unequivocally, that you do not have to bend to the world." Nadine reached across the white tablecloth and placed her hand gently over Julian's trembling, perfectly manicured fingers. Her touch was warm, grounding, and fiercely protective. "We never asked you to be our shield, Julian," she whispered, her voice a soothing contrast to the cold reality they had just survived. "I survived the South Side before you were born. Warren survived a world you cannot even begin to comprehend. We let you play the arrogant billionaire because we love you and because we wanted you to enjoy the safety you built, but never confuse the walls of the castle with the soldiers guarding the gates." Julian stared at his mother's hand resting over his own, and then looked back at Warren. The immense, crushing weight of his arrogance finally shattered completely, falling away like a heavy, useless shell. The $8 billion in his account still existed, but its meaning had been permanently altered. It was no longer his identity, it was just a number on a ledger. The man sitting across from him, the quiet, distinguished retiree with the devastating past, was the true anchor of their family. "I don't know who you really are," Julian admitted, his voice a barely audible whisper, thick with a newly discovered profound respect. "But I am deeply grateful that you are sitting at this table with my mother." Warren's deadpan expression finally softened, just a fraction. A very small, almost imperceptible smile touched the corners of his eyes. He reached out and briefly, firmly gripped Julian's shoulder. It was a gesture of acceptance, a silent acknowledgement that the war between them was permanently over. "Take a seat, Julian," Warren said calmly, gesturing to the empty chair the billionaire had abandoned before the chaos began. "The police will be taking statements for the next few hours, and your mother's coffee is getting cold." Julian Thorne, the man who controlled markets and bent entire industries to his will, nodded silently. He pulled out the cream-upholstered chair, the wooden legs scraping softly against the marble floor, and sat down at the table in the center foreground. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers continued to dance across the tall white walls, and the shattered security glass lay in ruins at the entrance of the glass orchid. But as Julian sat there, surrounded by the quiet, terrifying and profound strength of his family, he realized that for the very first time in his exceptionally wealthy life, he finally felt entirely, genuinely safe.